From 745 to 727 BC, Tiglath Pileser III ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He was a major figure in the rise of Assyria to power in the ancient Near East, and his reforms to the empire's military and administrative systems are still studied today. He ascended to the throne amid internal turmoil, enacting extensive reforms that centralized power, improved bureaucratic efficiency, and made the military a professional fighting force. His tactical military operations expanded Assyrian dominance over extensive territories, encompassing the Levant, Anatolia, and even Egypt, thereby securing vital trade routes and resources. He is also recognized for introducing innovative tactics, including the utilization of iron weaponry and sophisticated siege techniques, bolstering Assyria's military dominance. He also reconstructed the empire into provinces, overseen by local officials, and utilized systematic deportations and resettlements to assimilate the diverse populations and avert insurrections. His legacy is characterized by the creation of a formidable and extensive empire that attained unparalleled territorial expansion and established the groundwork for the enduring power and influence of Assyria in the centuries that would come. Hello, welcome to the channel. Here we are again, going way back, not quite arriving in the Bronze Age, but definitely well within the realm of that ancient world. As always, if you like the sort of content I make, you can just support by liking the video, subscribing, and telling all of your buddies to come and join the party. Now, with that being said, let's get nice and comfortable. And so we must say before we begin, the circumstance surrounding Tiglath Pileser's rise to power, they're a little bit obscure, equally as contentious. We just don't quite have the evidence about the exact process of his accession. We do have some records that do suggest that he may have seized the throne by force, but this is merely a suggestion. The occurrence of a revolt in 746 to 45 BC in Nimrud, the Assyrian Empire's capital, and a subsequent replacement of officials and governors after 745 BC certainly have the implication that his path to the throne may have involved considerable upheaval. But this is just a suggestion, is not concrete proof of it. Seems to certainly be well within the realm of possibilities. And then, of course, we have his lineage as depicted by Assyrian sources that is similarly complex and similarly inconsistent. While most of the Assyrian kings attributed their ascent to both a little bit of divine favor, a little bit of royal bloodline, Tiglath Pileser's inscriptions credit only divine selection as the reason for his rule. According to the Assyrian king list, which chronicles all the rulers of Assyria, his predecessor and supposed father was Ashurbanipal V. However, Tiglath Pileser's own inscriptions claim that he was actually Ashurbanipal's brother, and rather the son of Asarhaddon III. Well, what do the scholars think? Well, they generally agree that Tiglath Pileser was likely a usurper. Despite his usurpation, Tiglath Pileser's claim to the throne was still legitimate, likely supported by victory in a civil struggle within the ruling family. But there's also another suggestion that states that Tiglath Pileser might not have been related to the previous royal line at all. There certainly seems to be a lot of speculation. It's just the nature of this time period, where we receive our information from primary sources somewhat fragmentary, well, literally in fragments sometimes, as we pull out the tiny little pieces of the tablets out of the ground. But what we do know is that following his accession, there is no record of opposition or any further rebellion, indicating that he rather quickly secured his position. Questions do remain regarding his precise familial relationship with Ashur-Ninari and Adad-Nirari. While the Assyrian Kings list names him as the son of Ashur-Ninari, some experts, including Feichen, Shiego Yamada, and some other archaeologists, modern historians, propose that this might have actually been a mistake by the scribe. I hope somebody got fired for that blunder. With it being more plausible that Tiglath Pileser was the son of Adad-Nirari III. Well, also there is the possibility of his descent from Ashur-Ninari cannot be entirely dismissed, given the 38-year gap between Adad-Nirari's reign and the rise of Tiglath Pileser. Perhaps we'll never know. Either way, that scribe, I hope he lost his job if it was a mistake. Now, according to the Eponym Chronicle, which is a record of Assyrian officials and notable events for each year, there was a significant revolt in Nimrud in the year before Tiglath Pileser's accession. This rebellion in 746, along with Tiglath Pileser's subsequent coronation, suggests that it might have been more of a coup action. But it seems that he was not directly involved in leading the uprising. Some interpretations of the chronicle imply that he may have been aware or even just supported it from afar. The first official Tiglath Pileser, appointed as Eponym in 744, was Bel-Dan, and he was appointed as the governor of Nimrud, strengthening the idea that the revolt and Tiglath Pileser's rise were indeed connected. Whether or not he was leading from the front, well, that's still up for debate. There are also accounts that the rebellion of 746 was initiated by one Shamshi-Ilu, a prominent official during the reigns of Tiglath Pileser's predecessor, and subsequently quelled by Tiglath Pileser. Shamshi-Ilu's absence from records during Pileser's reign suggests he may have indeed rebelled. In fact, a few scholars do believe that Tiglath Pileser or his supporters confronted not only Shamshi-Ilu but also Ashur-Ninari, possibly in separate clashes. Now back to the Eponym Chronicle. It presents additional evidence that Tiglath Pileser may have shared power with Ashur-Ninari during his early years. The sequence of eponyms during Tiglath Pileser's initial reign deviates from the usual order. While the king would typically hold the eponym title in his second regnal year, this title was given to Bel-Dan in 744, with Tiglath Pileser only assuming the role later in 743. This anomaly of sorts, along with the presence of two dividing lines in the chronicle, one beneath the entry for 746, possibly marking Tiglath Pileser's rise, and another for 744, maybe signifying Ashur-Ninari's end. Either way, it suggests that Ashur-Ninari may have ruled jointly with Tiglath Pileser at least until 744, after which he was well and truly out of the picture. Since the second line comes immediately after a note that documents the length and end of Ashur-Ninari's reign, it is unlikely to be an error. According to the Eponym Chronicle and the Assyrian King List, Ashur-Ninari ruled for 10 years, and that's only feasible if he did so until 744 rather than 745. It's also unlikely that a civil war broke out if Ashur-Ninari did rule until 744, because Tiglath Pileser is known to have launched campaigns against Assyria's foreign adversaries during this period. and that would have been impossible if he was also embroiled in internal strife. Just simply too many moving parts. Well, the Assyrian king list mentioned in the Bible are typically known today by their biblical names, the Assyrian kings mentioned in the Bible, because Assyria has been primarily known for centuries through its appearances in the Hebrew Bible. Of course, we did have all of the tablets before then, but, well, archaeology in its original stages were only really chasing biblical matters. In fact, that was the entire reason why things were set up in Egypt in the first place, to trace the events of the book of Exodus. Fortunately, I don't think they found anything. Well, Tiglath Pileser was the original Akkadian name, and the Hebrew Tiglath Pileser is the source of the modern name Tiglath Pileser. Tiglath Pileser was apparently a regnal name, and it means my trust belongs to the son of Ashurbanipal. And apparently this was taken upon his accession to the throne, as many people adopt different names when they do so. Now, Ninurta was the son of Ashurbanipal and was worshipped at the temple of Ashurbanipal. Ninurta was also considered the son of the Assyrian national deity Ashur by the time of the reign of Tiglath Pileser. The name Pulu, whose etymology is admittedly unknown, is associated with Tiglath Pileser in a number of non-contemporary sources, including the Bible, Babylonian king list, Ptolemaic canon, and the writings of later Babylonian and Greco-historians. No modern historian or Babylonian source mentions Tiglath Pileser by name, and in fact there was no proof that it was ever used formally, despite the fact that it is occasionally understood as a second regnal name. Still, there's no proof that any Assyrian monarch ever used more than one regnal name during the period in which they reigned. Now, a little bit more about Assyria now in general, and the city of Ashur. Now, previously a city-state centered on the city of Ashur itself, Assyria became a prominent state under the Middle Assyrian Empire, around about the 14th century BC. So we're certainly going back to pretty much the Bronze Age, the end days of it, before the Sea People came and ruined everything. Well, following the 12th century BC, the Middle Assyrian Empire began to decline and was eventually confined to the Assyrian heartland region alone, contracted back to its original state. Now, even though active warrior kings occasionally stopped the decline, reconquest did not continue until the reign of Ashurbanipal from 934 to 912, who conducted campaigns in the northwest and across the northeast region. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is said to have begun with the accession of Adad-nirari II, and that was the son of Ashurbanipal I. Former Assyrian territories were gradually reclaimed under the early Neo-Assyrian kings, and the kings essentially had to rebuild the Assyrian Empire from scratch. So the project's success was an incredible accomplishment. The Neo-Assyrian Empire became the preeminent political force in the ancient Near East under Ashurbanipal, reigning from 883 to 859, Shalmaneser III, reigning after him until 824, the son of Ashurnasirpal, further increased the size of the Assyrian territory, but his enlarged domain was of course difficult to stabilize. His final years marked a new period of decline and stagnation that was characterized by internal and external conflict. The emergence of the northern kingdom of Urartu and the growing political power and influence of the magnates, a political group of Assyrian courtiers and officials, were Shalmaneser's two biggest issues in the later years of his rule. Since many vassal states saw submission to Urartu as a practical alternative to Assyria, Urartu's rise posed a threat to Assyrian hegemony. The Urartian writing system, religion, culture, and government were all very similar to that of Assyria. Like the Assyrian kings, the Urartian kings were also autocrats, despite being divided by the Taurus Mountains. Urartu and Assyria frequently engaged in military conflicts as a result of the imperialist expansionism pursued by their respective rulers. The Urartian army briefly matched that of Assyria. However, the Urartians achieved their own triumphs. Despite the Assyrians' numerous victories against Urartu, particularly the looting of Urartu's heartland toward the end of Shalmaneser's rule, the Assyrian army under Ashurbanipal V was routed at Arpad in 754 by the Urartian king Sarduri II, which might have actually prevented the Assyrian army from engaging in combat, at least for a few years. Since the magnates had progressively taken over as the main political actors and the central authority had weakened, the Assyrian kings were basically unable to handle external threats. The Assyrian royal power peaked during the reigns of Tiglath Pileser's three predecessors, Shalmaneser IV, 783 to 773, Ashurbanipal III, 73 to 55, and Ashurbanipal V. Shamsi-Ilu, the Turtanu commander-in-chief, during Shalmaneser IV's reign, had the audacity to claim military triumphs for himself instead of actually crediting them to the king. As a ruler, Ashurbanipal V seems to have been comparatively inactive, hands-off approach. He only made 3 campaigns, spent most of his reign in Assyria, and isn't known to have done really anything in terms of construction. I suppose he's just enjoying the good life of that Iron Age royalty. One of Tiglath Pileser's key early reforms was to increase the king's authority by decreasing the power of the magnates. The magnates' wealth and power were diminished when the large provinces they had previously controlled were divided into smaller units and placed under provincial governors chosen by the monarchy. Officials lost their authority to commission inscriptions pertaining to construction and military operations, and the king was now the only one with his authority. The names of some historically significant officials, like the Turtanu Shamsi-Ilu, were purposely removed from the inscriptions and records as part of a practice known as damnatio memoriae. We, of course, get this from the Latin to damn somebody's memory. The ability of the magnates to overthrow the king was all but destroyed by these reforms. As for the Assyrian army, they were revitalized by Tiglath Pileser, who turned it from a conscripted army that was only gathered in the warm seasons and was only active during certain seasons into a professional army. These conscripts were mostly replaced by skilled, trained, and specialized soldiers under Tiglath Pileser, much more effective. He brought in new and improved logistics, technology, and weaponry. New types of siege engines were among his most significant contributions. During his rule, the army's size was further expanded by hiring mercenaries from Babylonia, the Zagros Mountains, and even Anatolia, that's around modern-day Turkey. as well as by recruiting soldiers from the various conquered Assyrian territories. Even though Tiglath Pileser made enormous sums of money from his conquest, it seems he did not put much of it into the Assyrian heartland. The only construction he is known to have done was a new palace in Nimrud. Rather, the majority of the funds likely went to projects in the provinces and the formation of the new army, doubling down on conquest protocol. But the brutality of his conquest served to highlight the king's might and authority. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people were also frequently reseated. Tiglath Pileser's reign saw the start of frequent mass deportations, a practice that persisted under his successors, even though earlier monarchs had resettled people. This policy had two intended purposes. First, to lessen local identities in areas that had been conquered in order to prevent a revolt, and second, to recruit and relocate workers to areas that the Assyrian kings needed, such as the undeveloped and underutilized provinces. The resettled individuals were not injured, neither were they killed. At least, that's what they tell us. Despite the fact that the Assyrian resettlements were likely disastrous for them and the areas which they originated, the labor and skills of the deportees were of course highly valued. They made their travels and new communities as safe and cozy as they could. Tiglath Pileser's reign is distinguished by a number of huge military campaigns in all directions, in addition to his new reforms. Even though Tiglath Pileser wrote his annals on carved stone slabs that adorned his palace in Nimrud, detailing his military exploits in great detail, these are not well preserved. So for a number of his campaigns, we can only really produce a general outline. In 744, he launched his first campaign, attacking Babylonian territory on the east bank of the Tigris. With the Assyrio-Babylonian border moved in Tiglath Pileser's favor, this conflict was quickly resolved. He then established the two new provinces of Bit Amban and Parsua during his campaign in the surrounding Zagros Mountains in 743. Along a crucial trade route that foreshadowed the later Silk Road, the new province of Zagros were established. The Assyrian triumphs in 744 and 43 showed the neighbors of the empire that the Assyrian period of stagnation was over. Iranzu, king of the Manaeans, a people who lived in northwest Iran, met with Tiglath Pileser in person and formed an alliance in 744 as a result of Tiglath Pileser's success. Since Iranzu's realm was well positioned to defend Assyria from Urartian raids, Tiglath Pileser enthusiastically accepted the alliance. Previously, Iranzu's predecessors had maintained their kingdom's independence by switching allegiance between Urartu and Assyria. Sarduri II of Urartu became alarmed by these events and stepped up his attempts to challenge and subvert Assyrian dominance. Later, in 743, Sarduri and his army reached the Assyrian border of the Euphrates River, with reinforcements from other Assyrian kingdoms and states. Tiglath Pileser fought Sarduri close to Arpad the same year. Tiglath Pileser led a number of campaigns in the Levant between 743 and 32, which resulted in a significant annexation of the territory and the loss of the independence for many of the region's ancient states. Because of Arpad's strategic importance, and as retaliation for giving Sarduri access to the Assyrian frontier, he decided to take Arpad after defeating Sarduri. Arpad was then fully annexed in 740, following a protracted siege, and 3 campaigns spread over 3 years. Both Urartian troops and troops from other Syrian cities and smaller states provided support to Arpad during the conflict. The Assyrian army did not just pillage the city after capturing it and then withdraw, unlike how they handled Syrian cities in the past. Rather, the areas under Arpad's authority were incorporated into the Neo-Assyrian Empire and divided into 2 provinces. Following his triumph at Arpad, he was rewarded by the Phoenician city of Tyre, the Aramean kingdom of Aram-Damascus, and the Syro-Hittite kingdoms of Gurgum, Kuma, Carchemish, and Kuwe, some of whom had previously dispatched troops to support Saduri. Of course, the rulers of the Levant were on high alert after Arpad was annexed, everyone looking over their shoulder, wondering when their time would come. Many Levantine states had sought to grow and establish themselves as powerful kingdoms during the Assyrian stagnation period, which the Assyrians may have interpreted as aggressive, isolationist, and just all anti-Assyrian. And so Tiglath Pileser persisted in his endeavors in Syria in 738, establishing 3 new provinces of Kulania, Hattarika, and Simira, as well as capturing some territories south of Arpad. He claimed that the Syro-Hittite kingdom of Hama, who had ruled these territories, were actively conspiring against him. He used a well-planned and prepared strategy in his successful conquest of the Levant. First, he defeated smaller kingdoms with a swift, all-encompassing attack, rather than launching an assault on the capitals of the bigger states. His early conquest placed flat and coastal areas under his control, allowing Assyrian forces to advance quickly and effectively through the area in subsequent campaigns. The Syro-Hittite kingdom of Patin was subjugated and absorbed by Tiglath Pileser during the campaign against Hama. Hama was spared complete annexation. Instead, the kingdom was permitted to maintain some degree of autonomy as a vassal state. More states in the region, including the Kingdom of Israel, several states in eastern Anatolia, and the Phoenician city of Byblos and some Arab tribes, paid tribute to the Assyrians as a result of the victory. During the conflict, Hama had received aid from Israel and Damascus. The 5 Anatolian kingdoms that started paying tribute to Assyria most likely did so in hopes of receiving Assyrian assistance in fending off the expansionist kingdom of Phrygia, which threatened everyone's existence, rather than out of fear of the Assyrian conquest. Occasionally, the Anatolians attempted to pit Assyria and Phrygia against one another, and it yielded disastrous results. According to the Annals of Tiglath-Pileser, King Wasusarma of Tabau acted as if he were the equal of Assyria, and because of this, he was overthrown in 730 after he stopped paying the required tribute. For the 5th time in 734, Tiglath-Pileser advanced upon the Levant, marching all the way south to the Egyptian border. Assyria and Egypt shared a border for the first time in history as a result of this campaign, which led to the conquest of Gaza and the submission of many states, thereby bringing the entire Levant under the direct or indirect Assyrian rule. Either way, you always had an Assyrian looking over your shoulder. The Munna Arab tribe, Judah, Edom, Ascalana, Moab, and Ammon all started honoring Tiglath-Pileser. By expanding his dominion over the Levant, Tiglath-Pileser isolated Aram, Damascus, and Israel from Egypt, which had occasionally provided assistance to the Levantine states, and created a semicircle of control around them. Aram Damascus became geopolitically isolated as a result of the Assyrian efforts, and its population was left without a supply of food. And so, Tiglath-Pileser made the decision to solidify his conquest in 733. He ran another campaign this year against Aram Damascus, the region's strongest surviving native state, which was backed by Israel and the Assyrian tributaries Tyre and Asculana. Aram Damascus lands were annexed by Tiglath-Pileser after Damascus fell in 732. The same battle saw Tiglath-Pileser defeat Israel, annex the northern part of the kingdom as the province of Megiddo, and subjugate the southern part as a vassal kingdom. He also took Tyre. The Israelites interpreted the shrinking and massive shrinkage of Israel as confirmation of the prophet Amos's prophecies of impending disaster from a few decades earlier. And so Tiglath-Pileser and his armies encountered Arab tribes directly as a result of Assyria's enormous western expansion. And some of them started to pay tribute. In an attempt to strengthen his hold on southern Syria, he launched an offensive against the Kedarites south of Damascus in 733. The Kedarite queen, Samsi, was unprepared for the surprise attack, and the Kedarites were routed with ease. Despite its victory, Tiglath-Pileser recognized that he would not be able to successfully rule the Kedarites' lands, and so he permitted Samsi to keep control of her realm, albeit with an Assyrian official keeping watch and directing some of the finer points of the political activities. Oh, we can't let them have too much freedom, can't we? It was then that Tiglath-Pileser's attention shifted towards southern Babylon in his final years. During the Neo-Assyrian era, Babylonia was generally weaker than its northern neighbor, but it had once been a sizable and extremely powerful kingdom that had been in centuries of competition with Assyria. Babylonia suffered from internal ethno-cultural divisions, as well as a poorly organized army. Although they were not the only notable group in the area, Babylonians did control the majority of the major southern cities, including Babylon, Kish, Ur, Uruk, Borsippa, and Nippur. The majority of the southernmost land was ruled by Chaldean tribes, who were led by chieftains who frequently quarreled with one another. The Arameans were known for stealing from the surrounding areas, and also lived on the outskirts of populated areas. During his reign, Tiglath-Pileser monitored southern affairs through his agents. Nabu-Mukinzeri, a Chaldean chieftain from the Bit Amukani tribe, became the king of Babylon in 731. The accession of Nabu-Mukinzeri, who sought to mend the divisions in Babylonia, was viewed by Tiglath-Pileser as a provocation, and therefore a danger to Assyrian hegemony and interests. Something had to be done about that. Thus, Tiglath-Pileser spent the ensuing years working to overthrow Nabu-Mukinzeri and his followers, in order to guarantee that Nabu-Mukinzeri would not receive any assistance from Elam, which frequently opposed Assyrian interests. Assyrian armies first blockaded the eastern border of Babylonia. The Bit Shalani and Bit Sha'ali were among the Chaldean tribes and Aramean clans that Tiglath-Pileser subsequently vanquished and subdued. In 730, the real battle for Babylonia's dominance started. Assyrian emissaries are known to have traveled to Babylon during this year 730, urging the population to simply surrender to Tiglath-Pileser, open up the gates, and if they did, they'd get some nice little tax breaks, and also amnesty from the king. Not a bad deal if you really need the tax breaks. Well, the offer was, however, turned down by the Babylonians. You see, at this point, Nebuchadnezzar was most likely leading the Babylonian war effort from his ancestral home city of Sabia, rather than being in Babylon itself. Not sure if Tiglath Pileser knew that or not. Either way, Tiglath became the first Assyrian king to be acknowledged as such by the Babylonians when he conquered Babylonian in 729 and declared himself king of both Assyria and Babylon. And that is one of the titles of the old kings of Persia. Usually it's King of Kings, King of the Universe, King of Assyria and Babylon, this sort of thing. It goes on for a little while, but a very, very long title. Now, despite losing Sapia that same year, Nebuchadnezzar seems to have resisted Tiglath-Pileser until at least 728, according to some documents dated to his fourth regnal year. The Bit Dakuri and Bit Yakin, two of the most formidable Chaldean tribes, paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser as the new king. At this time, the Bit Yakin were led by Marduk Apla Idina II, who would become a fierce enemy of Assyria in the years after Tiglath's rule. In contrast to many other Assyrian conquests, Babylonia remained a single kingdom in personal union with Assyria, rather than being split up into provinces. The main reason for this was the Assyrians' deep regard for Babylonian religion and culture. Very deep roots. It goes back a while. And it's one of the reasons why you wanted to be the king of Assyria and Babylon. Having Babylon was the real prize. It'd been around for a long, long time. Well, in light of this regard, and the fact that Babylonia was beginning to recover economically, Tiglath made an effort to persuade the people to accept the concept of domination by Assyria. He led campaigns against the remaining Chaldean strongholds in the far south that opposed his rule, and he twice took part in the religiously significant New Year Akitu festival, which required the king's presence as a matter of tradition. Iaba, the queen of Tiglath-Pileser, seems to have been quite obviously not of Akkadian ancestry. In fact, Iaba's name may have come from the Arabic or West Semitic roots or etymologies for the words beautiful. Iaba may have been a princess from the kingdom of Judah, according to a 1998 theory by Stephanie Daly that she was of Hebrew descent. Now, based on the name Atalia, a later queen who was thought to have been related to Iaba, and the fact that it was similar to the name Athalia, which was given to a Judean queen who ruled roughly a century earlier, she argues that the name Atalia's ending might be a theophoric element derived from Yahweh. Both people have agreed with Daly's arguments and disagreed with them. Well, either way, we might not really know much about that one. I'm not too good with the linguistics of that area. Asian languages I'm really good with. I speak Chinese almost fluently. I know a fair bit of Japanese. And, well, Korean I can at least read. But I can't really speak too much. But it's very easy to learn how to read Korean. I suggest you do it. It'll take you like 3 hours and you'll be fine. Little practice. Anyway, back to the topic. Oh, it is thought that at this time Tiglath-Pileser had passed away quietly from old age. He was succeeded by his son, Shalmaneser V. Now, Shalmaneser was known by his birth name, Ululayu, during Tiglath-Pileser's reign, and Shalmaneser was a regnal name that he adopted upon taking the throne in 727. He probably took part in some of his father's campaigns too, as that was the normal practice, and he's known to have written in his father a number of letters, many of which included updates on the state of the territories that he oversaw. Sargon II succeeded Shalmaneser as king within a few years, most likely as the result of his overthrow and murder. Although Sargon was linked to the earlier kings by the Assyrian king list, which asserted that he was the son of Tiglath Pileser, this assertion is absent from the majority of Sargon's inscriptions, which emphasize that Ashur summoned and appointed him as the king. Well, either way, Tiglath Pileser left behind a legacy that's extremely important to history. Most people believe that his rule signaled the start of a completely new era of Assyrian imperialism. In fact, he's the first Assyrian king for whom there are external viewpoints and narratives of his reign. Most of the time, you just have the one opinion. But this time we have other people writing about him from other parts of the world. Well, I suppose they were part of the Assyrian Empire at some point, so that is also arguable, but we're just playing semantics now. Well, he's also, of course, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and the Babylonian Chronicles. In fact, the Hebrew Bible pretty much ignores all of Mesopotamian history before Tiglath-Pileser, and that's got to tell you something. The events of Tiglath-Pileser's reign are described in the Old Testament from the viewpoint of the southern kingdom of Judah, mainly in the book of Isaiah, Chronicles, and Kings, as well as his influence on the kingdom of Israel. We find that in 2 Kings 15. So he's mainly known for increasing the size of Assyrian territory. A conqueror. He's more than doubled the empire's territory by the time of his death, and that's a pretty good record. The economy of the Assyrian state was also drastically changed by his strategy of establishing direct Assyrian control over foreign territories by dividing them into provinces as opposed to establishing vassal kingdoms. Prior to his reign, the Assyrians had depended on tribute from vassals. However, they began to rely more and more on taxes collected by provincial governors after him. Although the strategy resulted in higher administrative expenses, it also decreased the likelihood of rebellions against Assyria. And that was the main problem in keeping your little satrapies and client states. Well, because of Tiglath-Pileser's imperial innovations, the Assyrian Empire served as a model for subsequent empires in the Middle East and beyond. The Neo-Assyrian kings claimed global dominance, known as translatio imperii, transfer of empire, spawned similar claims in later Middle Eastern empires, most notably the Achaemenid Empire. This helped aspirations for universal rule to emerge in many subsequent kingdoms and empires. But of course there were significant repercussions from the Assyrian resettlement program, which was, of course, as we've mentioned, accelerated under Tiglath-Pileser and carried on by his successors. First and foremost, it increased prosperity throughout the empire. Sure, it also resulted in notable improvements, irrigation in the provinces, this sort of thing, as deportees were assigned to teach their new communities the Assyrian-developed agricultural techniques. But the Middle East cultural and ethnic composition was permanently altered by the migration of peoples from all over the empire, and eventually a new language emerged as dominant: Aramaic, a status it held until the 14th century AD. Now that is a long time to be holding the record. Of the Semitic languages of the empire, to many of which the languages in the empire belonged, Aramaic was the most widely spoken and mutually understandable. Now, it was already an official language in the empire during Tiglath's reign, as evidenced by release from his error, that show the king recording messages in both Akkadian and Aramaic using scribes. Such a thing that certainly helps us understand and translate later texts. The best thing that you can find in archaeology is a text you don't recognize, or one that you're not familiar with in terms of the smaller little details of it, and it's right next to something recognizable. Let's say Greek or Egyptian hieroglyphics. This is what happened with the Rosetta Stone. When they found that, they found it in Egyptian, Greek, and Demotic, so they could very easily translate and figure out what was actually going on. So yes, it's very good that we have these in Aramaic and Akkadian. But that's a topic for another video, I suppose. Esarhaddon, who reigned from 681 to 669 BC, a distinguished king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, known for his military skill, architectural innovation, and effective administration. He ascended to the throne after his father, Sennacherib, was assassinated by his brothers, quickly consolidating power by eliminating rivals and securing provincial loyalty. He is celebrated for his successful campaigns against Egypt, establishing Assyrian influence in North Africa, and for restoring Babylon, enhancing his reputation for both strength and urban development. His reign featured significant infrastructure projects, including grand palaces and the ziggurat at Dur Sharukin, and he promoted religious tolerance by allowing the worship of multiple gods alongside the chief god Ashur. These policies not only stabilized and expanded the empire, but fostered a cultural flourishing under his reign, and thus it is a legacy that endures as a model of strategic leadership and visionary governance, enjoying the continued prosperity and influence of the Assyrian Empire into later generations. All right, welcome. Back we go to the old days of Assyria, once again for another Assyrian king, Esarhaddon. Now introduction's already out of the way, you know exactly how to support the channel. Just click the like and subscribe and leave a little comment. Tell a few of your friends to come and join the party and we can all learn. But let's get nice and relaxed first. That's what we're here for, isn't it? Now let's begin. Well, despite Esarhaddon holding the title of Crown Prince for 3 years as King Sennacherib's designated heir, it would seem that his path to the Assyrian throne was not an easy one. In fact, it was fraught with obstacles. You see, Sennacherib had originally chosen his eldest son, Ashur-nadin-sumi, as his successor, appointing him as the ruler of Babylon around 700 BC. Shortly afterwards, Sennacherib launched a campaign against the Elamites and some Chaldean rebels who had sought refuge in Elam, which is located in what is now in the modern state of southern Iran. In 694, the Elamites, retaliating against Sennacherib's assault, invaded Babylonia and managed to even capture Ashur-nadin-sumi in the city of Sippar. But they did return him to Elam. He was unfortunately executed when he got there. In response, Sennacherib was not impressed. He exacted severe revenge on the Elamites, Chaldeans, and Babylonians. After this death of Ashur-nadin-sumi, Sennacherib appointed his second eldest surviving son, Arda-Mulisu, as crown prince. Arda-Mulisu held this position for several years until he was unexpectedly replaced by Esarhaddon in 684. While the reason for his sudden removal is a little bit mysterious. Evidently, it caused him great distress. I'm sure it would. He's effectively lost the opportunity of becoming the ruler of the entire empire. I assume that would hit him pretty hard. Well, in fact, we're quite lucky because we have Esarhaddon talking in an inscription about how his brother reacted to his designation as a new heir. Yes, believe it or not, we actually have Esarhaddon's almost like a personal diary. How special is that? 2,500 years later. Well, we'll read it now. It goes like this. Of my older brothers, I was the younger brother. But by decree of the gods, Ashur and Shamash, Bel and Nabu, my father exalted me. Amid a gathering of my brothers, he asked Shamash, "Is this my heir?" And the gods answered, "He is your second self." And then my brothers went mad. They drew their swords godlessly in the middle of Nineveh. But Ashur, Shamash, Bel, Nabu, Ishtar, all the gods looked with wrath on the deeds of these scoundrels, brought their strength to weakness, and humbled them beneath me. Well, whether or not this actually happened, it might be a bit of mythology, but it's still interesting. Although Assurbanipal was compelled by his father to take an oath of allegiance to Esarhaddon, he made numerous appeals to Sennacherib to once more acknowledge him as the heir. Despite the fact that these appeals were all unsuccessful, sorry, Dad says no. Sennacherib came to the realization that the situation was indeed tense. The brothers were not just going to let him get away with this. As a result, he decided to send Esarhaddon into exile in the western provinces, at least for a little while, until the situation calmed down. But Esarhaddon was not happy with this. He was dissatisfied with his exile and placed the blame solely on his brother's behavior. He offered the following explanation for his dissatisfaction in his memoir. I still think it's lovely we have a memoir from that long ago. He said, "Malicious gossip, slander, and falsehood wove around me in a godless way, lies and insincerity. They plotted evil behind my back. Against all the will of the gods, they alienated my father's well-disposed heart from me, though in the secret his heart was affected with compassion, and he still intended me to exercise kingship." Sennacherib had foreseen the dangers of keeping Esarhaddon near his ambitious brothers, but he had not foreseen the dangers to his own life. On the 20th of October, 681, Assurbanipal and Nabu Saru-Usur, another son of Sennacherib, attacked and killed their own father inside a temple in Nineveh. The aspirations of Assurbanipal to take the throne, however, would no longer be fulfilled. The assassination of Sennacherib had caused some friction, of course, between Assurbanipal and his supporters, delaying the prospect of a coronation. Meanwhile, Esarhaddon, not to be walked over, had amassed an army. At Hanigalbat, in the western regions of the empire, he came upon an army that his brothers had raised. The enemy generals ran away, and most of the soldiers abandoned their brothers to join him. With this army at his back, he was able to confront them. He then marched on Nineveh with no opposition. An excerpt from Esarhaddon's own inscriptions describes his arrival in Nineveh and his subsequent purging of conspiracy supporters. "I entered Nineveh, my royal city, joyfully, and took my seat upon the throne of my father in safety. The south wind blew, the breath of A, the wind whose blowing is favorable, exercising kingship. There awaited me favorable signs in heaven and on earth, a message of the soothsayers, tidings, the gods and goddesses, continually, and gave my heart courage. The soldiers, the rebels who had fomented the plot to seize the rulership of Assyria for my brothers, their ranks I examined to the last man, and I laid a heavy penalty upon them. I destroyed their seed. Because of his turbulent ascent to the throne, Esarhaddon harbored, mistrust towards his family members, vassals, and servants. One can hardly blame him. It is unfortunately quite often that it's the people closest to you who are planning to stab you in the back, isn't it? Especially family. Weird how that works. He regularly asked priests and oracles for their opinions on whether any of his officials or family members were doing exactly that sort of plotting behind his back. Esarhaddon appears not to have been paranoid about his female relatives, though, despite his extreme mistrust of the male ones. During his rule, his mother, Naki-A, wife Esarhaddon, and daughter Sru-e-Etirat all held far more political clout and influence than women in previous Assyrian eras. But there was another indication of Esarhaddon's paranoia, that being his choice of residence. You see, one of his primary residences was a palace in Nimrud that had been built nearly 2 centuries earlier as an armory by his predecessor, Shalmaneser III. He reigned from 859 to 824. The palace was well protected because it was situated on a separate mound on the city's outskirts, rather than in a prominent location within the administrative and cultural hub. It was fortified between 676 and 72, with its gateways transformed into impregnable fortifications that could completely isolate the structure from the city. A steep and narrow path, guarded by multiple sturdy doors, would be the only way to enter the palace if these entrances were sealed. At Nineveh, a comparable palace was constructed on a different mound, distant from the city center. Every Assyrian king is known to have consulted the sun god Shamash for advice on political and military issues, how to reign well, things like this, such as who to assign a particular position as well, or whether a planned military campaign would succeed, kind of like the Oracle of Delphi in the Greek tradition. And the advice was obtained by interpreting what they thought to be signs from the gods. Only during the reign of Esarhaddon are questions about the potential for betrayal known. That shows how paranoid he really was. Of course, Esarhaddon wanted the people of Babylon, the southern region of his empire, to support him. For this reason, the king had invested far more in building and restoration projects in the south than any of his predecessors had. Prior to its conquest and annexation by the Assyrian king Tiglath Pileser III in the previous century, Babylonia was ruled by native kings as vassals of the Assyrians, and it had only recently become an inner part of the Assyrian Empire. Esarhaddon's building program was probably intended to demonstrate the advantages of maintaining Assyrian control over the area, and to demonstrate his intention to govern Babylon with the same consideration and magnanimity as a native Babylonian ruler would. Put the people's minds at ease. Give them what they want, I suppose. They're not going to complain if they get that, aren't they? Aren't they? Maybe. Either way, for over a millennium, the city of Babylon, which is the name of Babylonia, of course, served as the political hub of southern Mesopotamia. The statue of Bel, also called Marduk, you may have heard of that, the city's patron deity, had been carried far into Assyrian territory, when Esarhaddon's father destroyed the city in 689 BC in an attempt to crush the Babylonian ambitions for independence. One of Esarhaddon's most significant initiatives was the city's restoration, which he had announced in 680. The size of the construction project is described in reports from the officials the king assigned to supervise the reconstruction during Esarhaddon's rule. But in fact, Esarhaddon writes about it himself. Once again, we go back to that great primary source, and he writes about the reconstruction of Babylon as follows. Great king, mighty monarch, lord of all, king of the land of Ashur, ruler of Babylon, faithful shepherd, belover of Marduk, lord of lords, dutiful leader, loved by Marduk's consort Zurbanitum, humble, obedient, full of praise, and for their strength and awestruck from its earliest days in the presence of their divine greatness, am I, Esarhaddon. When in the reign of an earlier king there were ill omens, the city offended its gods, and was destroyed at their command. It was me, Esarhaddon, whom they chose to restore everything to its rightful place, to calm their anger, to assuage their wrath. You, Marduk, entrusted the protection of the land of Ashur to me. The gods of Babylon, meanwhile, told me to rebuild their shrines and renew the proper religious observances of their palace, Esagila. I called up all my workmen and conscripted all the people of Babylonia. I set them to work, digging up the ground and carrying the earth away in baskets. And so, like that, he painstakingly restored every building and every structure in the city, and that includes the gates, battlements, drains, courtyards, shrines, everything. There was no stone unturned. He was very keen to be the one who restored Babylon to its former glory. I mean, what's the point in ruling over Babylon if Babylon's just a pile of dirty and dusty rocks? Well, as part of the meticulous restoration process, valuable stones, fragrant oils, and perfumes were carefully placed into the Esagila's foundations. The temple doors were covered with precious metal, and the pedestal that would hold the Bel statue was made of gold. Do remember that Bel is the other name for Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon. Now, there is a report from the newly appointed Babylonian governor, Esarhaddon, that verifies that the building was well received by the Babylonians, and it is as follows. I have entered Babylon. The Babylonians have received me kindly, and daily they bless the king, saying, what was taken and plundered from Babylon, he has returned. And from Sibar to Bab-Marat, the chiefs of the Chaldeans bless the king, saying, it is he who resettled the people of Babylon. So from that, obviously, people are extremely impressed with Esarhaddon. He's doing a very, very good job of getting public opinion on his side, which, of course, helps when you don't want rebellions to come up. Although a lot of work was done during Esarhaddon's successor's rule, the city's reconstruction was not finished during his lifetime. Although it is unclear how much of the reconstruction was finished during Esarhaddon's rule, stones bearing his inscriptions can be discovered in the city's temple ruins, indicating that a significant amount of work had been finished. With the possible exception of the city walls, which his successor most likely restored completely, Esarhaddon most likely achieved his restoration objectives, including the near-complete restoration of Esagila and Etemenanke. Programs for restoration in other southern cities were also funded by Esarhaddon, because it wasn't just Babylon that needed fixing. And so, he returned the statues of several southern gods that had been taken during the battles of old times and stored in Assyria during the first year in power, along with statues of other traditional Babylonian deities. The statue of Bel had been housed in the northernmost Assyrian town of Isete in the period following Sennacherib's destruction of the city. Statues of other gods were brought back to the cities of Der, Humhumia, Sipar Uraru, while the statue of Bel remained in Assyria. Statues were also brought back to the cities of Larsa and Uruk in the years that followed. Esarhaddon also restored Uruk's Eanna temple, which was devoted to the goddess Ishtar, and removed debris just as he had done in Babylon. Similar scale restoration initiatives were also carried out in Borsippa, Akkad, and Nippur, all the classic old cities. You know, it would be a great idea for a road trip to go to all those old Bronze Age sites. I don't know if international driver's licenses work in Iran. Well, it might not be the best time to go to Iran at the moment. But I'll have to look into that. That would be a great road trip. Well, some academics have referred to Esarhaddon as the Babylonian king of Assyria, for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, you've got the massive construction, but also you have this attempt to align himself with the Babylonian royal tradition. However, this might not accurately reflect the king's true endeavors, and it might be a way of subtly taking a dig at him. Well, like his predecessors, Esarhaddon maintained his political and military base in the north while ruling both Babylonia and Assyria. Though they were less civically oriented than those in Babylonia, he also finished projects in the Assyrian heartland, despite his remarkable, ambitious, and unprecedented building projects in the south. And so he made sure that repairs were made to the temple of Ashara in Ashur, one of the principal temples of northern Mesopotamia, perhaps to reassure the Assyrians that his projects in the south would be matched with projects of equal proportion in the north, and yes, that would be quite a balancing act. That's all good and well to get the Babylonians on your side so the provinces away from home don't rebel. But if the people at home are unhappy with you, well, that's equally as big of a problem. While similar projects were carried out for temples in the cities of Arbela and Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, the numerous administrative and military construction projects carried out in the north, and the total absence of such in the south demonstrates his preference somewhat for Assyria over Babylonia, at least in some regards. Even though the temple building projects carried out in the south were matched with those in the north, these military and administrative projects just were not. I suppose you've got to do a cost-benefit analysis. You can't rely on Esarhaddon to fix the entire empire, can't you? Foreign powers, eager to increase their territory, quickly discovered that despite Esarhaddon's mistrust, the Assyrian governors and soldiers fully supported the new king, as did all the vassals who had hoped to use the unstable political climate in Assyria to actually free themselves, possibly thinking that the new king hadn't really solidified his position enough to actually stop them if they were to rebel. And so the Cimmerians, an Iranian nomadic tribe that was threatening Assyria's northwestern borders, and the kingdom of Urartu, at the time ruled by King Rusa II in the north, and a sworn enemy of Assyria that continued to shelter its brothers, were the two of the main country's enemies. In an attempt to deter the Cimmerians from attacking, Esarhaddon formed an alliance with the nomadic Scythians, who were renowned for being absolute champions on horseback. However, it didn't really seem to have worked. Temples and cities were destroyed as the Cimmerians advanced deeper into the empire in 676 BC, after invading the westernmost provinces in 679 BC. Esarhaddon personally led his troops in combat in Cilicia and repulsed the Cimmerians in order to halt this invasion, and according to his inscriptions, Esarhaddon killed the Cimmerian king, Teuspa, with his own hands. The Phoenician city-state of Sidon, one of Esarhaddon's vassals in the Levant, rebelled against his rule during the height of the Cimmerian invasion. Having been made vassal by Esarhaddon's father in 601, Sidon had only recently fallen to Assyria. In 677, Esarhaddon led his army down the Mediterranean coast and took the rebellious city. But Abdi Milkuti, the king, managed to flee by boat. A year later, when Esarhaddon decisively defeated the Cimmerians, he was taken prisoner and put to death. Sanduari of Kundu and Sisu, probably places in Cilicia, another dissident vassal king, was also vanquished and put to death. Esarhaddon had the heads of the two vassal kings draped around the necks of their nobles, who were paraded throughout Nineveh to commemorate his triumph. What a sight that would have been to see. The two cities that had belonged to the Sidonian king were given to Baal of Tyre, another vassal king, and Sidon was reduced to an Assyrian province. We have an inscription from the time in which Esarhaddon discusses the victory. Abdi Milkulti, king of Sidon, who did not fear my majesty, did not heed the word of my lips, who trusted in the fearful sea and cast off my yoke, Sidon, his garrison city which lies in the midst of the sea. Like a fish, I caught him up out of the sea and cut off his head. His wife, his sons, the people of his palace, property, goods, precious stones, garments of colored wool and linen, maple and boxwood, all kinds of treasures of his palace in great abundance I carried off. His wide-spreading peoples, there was no numbering them. Cattle, sheep, and donkeys in great number I transported to Assyria. Esarhaddon focused on Urartu after resolving these issues in Sidon and Cilicia, and he initially attacked the Manaeans, traditional allies of Urartu. But by 673 he was openly at war with Urartu's own kingdom. The kingdom of Shupria, a vassal state of Urartu, with its capital at Ubumu on the shores of Lake Van, was attacked and subjugated by Esarhaddon as part of the conflict. The king of Shupria's refusal to turn over political refugees from Assyria, possibly some of the conspirators behind Sennacherib's death, was the king's casus belli, the war justification for this invasion. Despite the Shuprian king's agreement to relent after a protracted exchange of letters, Esarhaddon felt that it took him too long. When the defenders tried to burn down the Assyrian siege weapons, the fires spread into Ubumu, and the Assyrians took control of the city, pillaging it. Political refugees were taken prisoner, and after a while put to death. Perhaps to improve relations, some Urartu criminals, who the Shuprian king had similarly refused to hand over to the Urartu king, were captured and sent back to Urartu. After Ubumu was restored, given a new name, and annexed, 2 eunuchs were chosen to serve as its governors. If you don't know what a eunuch is, look it up. Sippar was taken by the Elamites during their invasion of Babylonia in 675. The Assyrian army was compelled to halt its campaign in Anatolia in order to protect the southern provinces while it was away. This conflict was not well documented, which is really unfortunate. Everything else seems to be quite well documented except for this one. Either way, Esarhaddon makes pretty much no mention of it in any of his inscriptions. And why is that? Well, it seems to be because the fall of Sippar was actually quite a humiliating event. He didn't want to write about the battles that he had lost. The Elamite king, Kumban Kautash II, passed away shortly after taking Sippar, leaving Urtak, the new ruler, in a very precarious situation. Urtak halted the invasion and gave back some of the god statues that the Elamites had taken in order to mend fences with Assyria and prevent more fighting. In order to raise their children at each other's courts, the two kings formed an alliance. In the winter of 673, Esarhaddon took the chance to invade Egypt, close to the end of his 7th year in power. Only a small number of Assyrian sources mention this invasion, which culminated in what some academics believe to have been one of Assyria's most devastating losses. Well, if we remember the situation in Sippar not being very well documented, we can perhaps draw this conclusion. Esarhaddon had hoped to invade Egypt and eliminate his rival in a single blow, because the Egyptians, you see, had supported rebels and dissenters in Assyria for years, funding those undesirable elements. Once outside the Egyptian-controlled city of Ashkelon, where the Kushite pharaoh Taharka defeated the Assyrians, they were worn out due to the rapid marches of the Esarhaddon's army. And so Esarhaddon withdrew to Nineveh after his defeat, temporarily abandoning his plan to conquer Egypt. Esarhaddon's health was clearly declining by 673, when he launched his first unsuccessful invasion of Egypt. This was problematic to say the least, because having perfect physical and mental health was one of the main prerequisites for becoming the Assyrian king. People were starting to talk behind his back. The king would frequently spend days in sleeping quarters, refusing food, not even drinking anything, not even seeing anyone. He was always ill. It's unlikely that his condition improved after his beloved wife Ashurbanipal passed away herself in 672, reportedly around the month of February. The majority of the surviving court records indicate that Esarhaddon was frequently depressed, lost his will to live. He was so depressed over the deaths of his wife and also their newborn child. Just add that to the pile. Letters from Adad Shemu Usur, the king's chief exorcist, and the person primarily in charge for Esarhaddon's welfare, make this very evident. One letter says, "As to what the king, my lord, wrote to me, I am feeling very sad. How did we act that I become so depressed for this little one of mine? Had it been curable, you would have given away half your kingdom to have it cured. But what can we do? Oh, king, my lord, it is something that cannot be done." Esarhaddon's condition is described in some detail in notes and letters that have been preserved from people who worked at the royal court, including his doctors. They include descriptions of severe fever, vomiting, dizziness, earaches, nosebleeds, depression, and even diarrhea. Because of persistent skin rashes that covered most of his body, including his face, the king feared that his time was running out. His condition would have been obvious to anyone who saw him. The king was dying. The doctors, probably the best that Assyria had to offer, were completely baffled and eventually they just had to admit that they could do nothing to help him. There is a letter that makes it very evident in these ways, like the following. It reads, "My lord, the king, keeps telling me, why do you not identify the nature of my disease and find a cure? As I told the king already in person, his symptoms cannot be classified." Now here's the problem. Like with many cultures in the world, a sick king would have been interpreted by the Assyrians as a sign that the gods did not support him, and they believed that the illness was a form of divine punishment. Esarhaddon had to conceal his ill health from his subjects at all costs as a result. The ancient Assyrian royal custom of requiring anyone approaching the king to be both veiled and on their knees guaranteed his subjects' ignorance. They weren't really allowed to look at him. Just hope he wasn't coughing or anything when he spoke to them. That would probably give it away. Well, since he himself had only gained the Assyrian throne through extreme hardship, Esarhaddon took a number of measures to guarantee a peaceful and orderly handover of power after his own passing. But you see, all of Esarhaddon's sons at this time were still minors, which was a big problem. According to a treaty signed in 672 between Esarhaddon and his vassal Ramatiah, the ruler of an eastern Median kingdom known as Uruk-Azabarna, Esarhaddon's concern over the possibility of multiple factions opposing his successor's ascent to the throne after his death is also demonstrated by the same treaty, which names his successor's brothers, uncles, cousins, and even descendants of former royalty, and one of the chiefs or governors of Assyria as possible opposing forces. This suggests that Esarhaddon had at least a few surviving brothers, and that they or their offspring might pose a threat to his own children. The reference to descendants of former royalty may actually refer to the fact that Sargon II, Esarhaddon's grandfather, had usurped the Assyrian throne, and may not have had any ancestry. The Assyrian throne might have been contested by descendants of previous kings, who might still be alive and able to do so. Esarhaddon finally named his eldest son, Sin-nadin-apli, as crown prince in 674 to prevent a civil war after his death. But he passed away 2 years later, posing another threat to the succession. Better find somebody else. This time, Esarhaddon named 2 crown princes, Ashurbanipal, his younger son, who was chosen to be the heir of Assyria, and Shamash-shum-ikin, his oldest surviving son, was chosen to be the heir of Babylon. Together, the 2 princes reached Nineveh's capital, where they celebrated with Assyrian soldiers and nobles as well as foreign dignitaries. The mothers of the 2 sons may have contributed to the decision to designate an older son as the crown prince of Babylon and a younger as the one of Assyria, which was obviously Esarhaddon's principal title. Shamash-shum-ukin was the son of a Babylonian woman, whereas Ashurbanipal's mother was probably Assyrian. Although it's kind of unclear, it's possible that Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin had the same mother, which would have had the unfavorable effects if Shamash-shum-ukin had have succeeded to the Assyrian throne. Ashurbanipal was the superior contender to the throne because he was the next oldest son. Shamash-shum-ukin was chosen to inherit Babylon and the southern regions of his empire, because Esarhaddon likely assumed that Babylonians would be happy with a king of Babylonian descent. Esarhaddon intended relationship between his two sons is not entirely clear from the treaties he drafted. Either way, in an effort to prevent bloodshed that started Esarhaddon's own reign, Esarhaddon's mother Naki-A made sure that any prospective rivals or claimants took an oath to back Ashurbanipal's ascent to the Assyrian throne. In 672, Esarhaddon himself also signed a succession treaty with several of his own governors outside the Assyrian heartland, and with at least 6 independent rulers in the east to secure the succession of Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin. The prospect that his brothers, especially Arda-Mulisu, was still alive and wished to claim the Assyrian throne, may have been the primary driving force behind the creation of these treaties. According to some inscriptions, they were still alive and very much free in 673. Now, it wasn't completely over for Esarhaddon. Early in 671, it seems he marched against Egypt once more. In order to avoid the issues that beset his first attempt, he marched at a much slower pace and used a significantly larger army. He traveled through Haran, one of the larger cities in his empire's western regions. In this instance, the king was given a prophecy that said Esarhaddon would successfully conquer Egypt. Following his passing, a letter to Ashurbanipal stated the following: When Esarhaddon marched to Egypt, a temple of cedar wood was erected at Haran. There, the god Sin was enthroned on a wooden column, 2 crowns on his head, and standing in front of him was the god Nuska. Esarhaddon entered and placed the crowns onto his head, and the following was proclaimed: You shall go forth and conquer the world. And he went and conquered Egypt. Esarhaddon's forces won their first conflict with the Egyptians 3 months after receiving this prophecy. Esarhaddon was not persuaded of his own safety, even after the prophecy and initial success. 11 days after defeating the Egyptians, he carried out the ancient Assyrian practice known as the substitute king ritual, which was meant to shield the king from impending danger signaled by an omen of some kind. In fact, earlier in his reign he'd carried out the ritual, but this time it prevented him from leading his invasion of Egypt. During the 100-day substitute king ritual, the Assyrian monarch went into hiding, and a replacement, ideally someone with mental impairments, took the throne by sleeping in the royal bed, donning the crown and royal accoutrement, and consuming the king's food. The real king was only known as the farmer during these 100 days, and he stayed hidden away. The purpose of the ritual was to keep the real monarch safe by directing any evil that was meant for the king toward the replacement king, who was killed at the end of the 100 days regardless of whether anything had happened. Regardless of the omen Esarhaddon feared, he lived through 671 and would repeat the rite twice in the 2 years that followed, which prevented him from carrying out his responsibilities as the Assyrian king for nearly a whole year. His crown princes oversaw the majority of his empire's civil administration during this period, and Ashur-Nasir, his chief eunuch, most likely led the army in Egypt. The Assyrian army successfully captured and pillaged Memphis, the Egyptian capital, and defeated the Egyptians in 2 more battles. In the Levant, the Egyptian army was also compelled to battle some of their vassals, including Baal of Tyre, who had joined forces with the Egyptians to oppose Esarhaddon. The majority of the royal court and the pharaoh's family including his son and wife, were taken as hostages and sent back to Assyria, despite the pharaoh's escape himself. Conquered lands were turned over to governors who supported the Assyrian monarch. A vassal king is seen kneeling in front of Esarhaddon, who is portrayed in a majestic pose holding a war mace on his hand on a victory stele, which was built to honor Egypt's defeat. Kinda like the Narmer palette. It's kinda the same sort of thing. Of course, you've got the victor being about 10 foot tall and the other guy being about 5 feet tall, this sort of thing. Well, the son of the vanquished pharaoh was also shown kneeling, wearing a rope around his neck. Many Egyptians were forced to relocate to the Assyrian heartland as a result of this conquest. News of a new prophecy at Haran quickly circulated throughout Esarhaddon's empire after his victory in Egypt. The oracles of Haran were considered reliable, since Esarhaddon had taken Egypt and validated the earlier prophecy from the city. The prophecy's meaning was obvious. By claiming that all of Sennacherib's descendants were usurpers, it offered a potential religious basis for rebellion against Esarhaddon's authority. Of course, Esarhaddon's skin condition might have been discovered during his trip to Haran, which could have led to his illegitimacy being declared. We don't quite know who was declared the legitimate king, but it's possible that he had some connection to the earlier Assyrian royalty in order to be eligible to the throne, perhaps a descendant of Sargon II. Well, his name was Sarsi, and he swiftly garnered a sizable following across the empire, even winning over Esarhaddon's chief eunuch Ashur-Nasir. It was not long before Esarhaddon discovered the plot. He was so paranoid that he had a huge network of servants all over the empire who sworn to inform him of any planned attacks upon him. These reports alerted Esarhaddon to the existence of conspirators in Babylon and the Assyrian heartland, in addition to Haran. For some time, he merely collected intelligence on the conspirators' actions, and out of fear for his life, carried out the substitute king rite a second time in 671 BC, only 3 months after completing it the first time. After the ceremony was finished, Esarhaddon came out of hiding and slaughtered the conspirators in what was the second purge of that kind under his rule. It is unclear what happened to Sarsi and the woman who crowned him king, but it is likely they were taken prisoner and quickly put to death. The number of officials killed caused more damage to Assyria's administrative system than it had in a long time. It was very uncommon in Assyrian history for no official to choose the year's name during the first few months of 670. The remains of a number of structures in different cities that are thought to have been inhabited by Sarsi supporters have also been dated to this year. Despite his successful escape from the conspiracy, Esarhaddon continued to be paranoid and ill. He again, for the 3rd time, carried out the substitute king rite in 669. Egypt at this time might have been motivated to try to break away from Esarhaddon's rule at the time of the appearance of the vanquished pharaoh Taharka from the south and the unstable political climate in Assyria. When Esarhaddon heard about this uprising, he discovered that some of his own governors, whom he had appointed to Egypt, had stopped paying homage to him and actually joined with the rebels, and so he left to launch his 3rd campaign against Egypt, emerging from his 100 days of hiding, seemingly in good health by his standards. But before even arriving at the Egyptian border, Esarhaddon suddenly passed away. Roughly November 1st, in the Julian calendar, 669 BC. Well, since there is no evidence to the contrary, it appears his death was unexpected and natural. I'm sure there was plenty of talk, though. Esarhaddon's succession plans, however, were successful, at least initially, and his sons Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin succeeded in ascending the thrones of Assyria and Babylonia, without any significant political unrest or bloodshed after his death. Ashurbanipal, 668 to 627 BC. He was one of the most illustrious kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, renowned for his military conquest, cultural patronage, and of course administrative reform. Ascending to the throne following his father Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal successfully expanded Assyrian dominance through formidable campaigns in Egypt, Elam, and across Mesopotamia. A passionate patron of the arts and scholarship, he is best remembered for establishing the great library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, an unprecedented repository of Mesopotamian literature. It is where we find the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has provided valuable insights, of course, into ancient civilizations. His reign also saw significant advancements in agriculture and the preservation of cultural heritage, but despite all this success, his later years were marked by strife and the burgeoning pressures that would eventually contribute to the empire's decline. Nonetheless, we have a legacy of Ashurbanipal that endures as a testament to the heights of Assyrian power and the enduring value of this cultural preservation, and that positions him as a pivotal figure in the history of the ancient Near East. And welcome back, here we are, once again, going back to the old days of Persia. Not quite the Bronze Age. Back in those good old days. Well, it's good to see you again if you're returning, and for the newcomers, good to meet you. Now, if you are new, how about you click the subscribe button, and if you're coming back and haven't done so yet, well, it's only a small movement of the finger. Now, with that being said, let's get started, nice and relaxed, as always. Now, the aforementioned dates of 668 to 627, that is his reign date, which is typically where we really start to chart the course of his story. But if we're going to go back even earlier than that, of course, we start from 685, where he was born. We mentioned that his father was Esarhaddon, who I've also done a video about, and he reigned from 681 to 669. Even though Ashurbanipal's inscriptions imply that he was destined to rule by a divine magnate, this old tradition of being ordained by the deities above themselves, it seems that his accession was anything but simple, and the complexities that followed planted the seeds for a subsequent civil war. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Being younger than Shin-Adin-Apli, Esarhaddon's first crown prince, and the two other sons, Shamash-shum-ukin and Shamash-metu-ubalit, Ashurbanipal was most likely the fourth oldest son. In addition, he had multiple younger brothers, and an older sister named Serua-Eterat. 674 BC, we have the sudden death of Sin-Adin-Apli, which caused chaos in the Assyrian court. The civil war that followed was won by Esarhaddon after his own father, Sennacherib, had eschewed his older brother, Ardamulisu, for the throne and was assassinated by the rejected heir. That's right, killed by his own blood. Esarhaddon swiftly established new succession plans following the death of his own heir, designating his eldest surviving son, Shamash-shum-ukin, as king of Babylon, that being the area of southern Mesopotamia, and his younger son, Ashurbanipal, as the primary emperor of Assyria. The two were to rule as equals. At least, that was the idea. But perhaps due to poor health, he completely avoided his third oldest son, Shamash-Metu-Ubalit, who was actually older than Ashurbanipal, and typically that would make him more qualified to take the throne. Seems that this didn't happen. Well, the reasons behind Esarhaddon's divided succession, which deviated from the Assyrian custom of unitary rule, have been more than conjectured by scholars. It's possible the arrangements were made to prevent future rivalry by easing the elder Shamash-Shum-Ukin's jealousy of his younger brother Ashurbanipal. According to one theory, Shamash-Shum-Ukin may not have been as likely to succeed Ashurbanipal on the Assyrian throne. The reason for this being that his mother was actually Babylonian, whereas Ashurbanipal's mother was actually Assyrian. But it's also possible that the two heirs had a mother in common, being Esarhaddon's main consort, Esarhaddon. Well, hopefully we'll figure out a little bit more about that if we dig some old tablet out of the ground in the next few decades, or perhaps finally translate the many thousands of them we have just sitting in storage. Most of them are actually just receipts from trade transactions, but every now and then they come across one that is somewhat groundbreaking. Let's cross our fingers. Well, together the two princes reached Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and celebrated in May 672 with foreign dignitaries, Assyrian aristocrats and military leaders. As his previous name is unknown, Ashurbanipal, or Assurbanipal, which means Ashur is the creator of the air, Ashur being the chief deity of Assyria, of course, was probably given to him at this time as a kind of regnal title. Perhaps around the same period, Ashurbanipal wed his first wife, Libali Sharat, who would later become his queen. He then entered the crown prince's palace, known as the House of Succession, and started studying, hunting, riding, scholarship, and wisdom, also archery and chariotry and other military arts in preparation for his responsibilities as a ruler. After Esarhaddon's death, Ashurbanipal, who had only been crown prince for 3 years, succeeded him as the king of Assyria late 669. But his sovereignty might not have been safe, but he rode to what might have been the most powerful throne on earth nonetheless. The Segudu Treaty, drafted by his grandmother Naki'a, obligated the aristocracy, the royal family, and all of Assyria to pledge their unwavering allegiance to Ashurbanipal. However, it doesn't seem like there was much opposition to his ascent to power at all, unlike previous times where things were markedly more chaotic. Ashurbanipal's gift of the revered statue of Marduk, which Sennacherib had taken from Babylon 20 years prior, marked his coronation. Also, we may hear of this as the statue of Bel, which is the other rendering of the name Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Well, for 16 years, Shamash-Shum-Ukin would govern Babylon, ostensibly without open conflict with his younger brother, although there would be frequent disputes over how independent he should be. But that would come later. Now, the distribution of power between the two heirs was admittedly a little unclear in Esarhaddon's succession decrees, which certainly opens up things to problems. Ashurbanipal was not allowed to meddle in Shamash-Shum-Ukin's internal affairs, perhaps out of concern that his elder brother would have had the resources to challenge his authority if he gained full independence. Either way, Ashurbanipal eventually tipped the scales in his favor. And then we turn to Egypt, which was first ruled by the Assyrians in 671, when Ashurbanipal's father, Esarhaddon, overthrew the Kushite pharaoh Taharqa. I explain all of that in the Esarhaddon video. It was the pinnacle of the Assyrian Empire, and Esarhaddon's greatest victory, albeit very hard fought. Taharqa then fled south to Nubia and plotted to retake his lands, demonstrating the weakness of Assyrian control over a very chaotic Egypt. Esarhaddon then designated local Egyptian nobles as the nation's vassal rulers and dispatched troops to garrison Egyptian cities. He left Nineveh to confront the threat when Taharqa led Egypt in a revolt against Assyrian rule in 669, but became ill and passed away en route. As Ashurbanipal succeeded to his father's throne, the campaign stalled, and many Egyptian vassal rulers joined the uprising to drive out the foreign invaders. Ashurbanipal dispatched an army to fight the rebels after they massacred the Assyrian garrison in Memphis. The Assyrian army gathered tribute and military support from various Levantine vassal states, such as Manasseh of Judah and several Cyprus rulers en route to Egypt. The expeditionary forces prevailed in a major battle at Carbonito in Lower Egypt, after fighting their way through the main land of Egypt across the Nile Delta. Now, Assyrian sources claim that the Assyrian army retook Memphis after Taharqa and his followers fled to Thebes, and then returned to Nubia. Necho I, a local vassal ruler, was among the conspirators who had stayed in Memphis and were returned to Assyria. They were then unexpectedly permitted to return and resume their positions in Egypt after taking new oaths of allegiance. Tantamani, the nephew of Taharqa, declared himself pharaoh after Taharqa's death in 664. He then invaded Egypt, quickly took Thebes, and advanced upon the capital of Memphis. Ashurbanipal dispatched the Assyrian army once more, and as soon as they arrived in Egypt, Tantamani fled south. The Assyrians severely looted Thebes in a kind of payback for the repeated uprising. The ancient city was one of Egypt's most important political and religious hubs, and this sacking was the worst disaster to have ever hit it. Without the astute diplomacy of its governor, Mentuemat, the city might have been destroyed. Well, as for Tantamani, there was no further pursuit of him outside of Egypt. He seems to have simply disappeared. Perhaps an easy retirement. Either way, the Assyrian army returned to Nineveh, and many obelisks and treasures were repurposed to be used in Ashurbanipal's projects, and the spoils from Thebes were proudly paraded in a triumph through the streets. The Elamite king Urdak, who had maintained cordial ties with Esarhaddon, unexpectedly attacked Babylonia in 665, an unwelcome surprise. Urdak, though, died soon after being successfully forced back into Elam. Teoman, who was unrelated to the previous king, succeeded him as Elamite king and had to eliminate his political opponents in order to maintain his position of authority. Teoman demanded that Urdak's 3 sons, who were the main rivals for the Elamite throne, be brought back to Elam, but they fled to Assyria and were taken in by Ashurbanipal himself. In 653, Teoman launched an attack on Babylonia, following a protracted period of peace. Shamash-shum-ukin had to rely on Ashurbanipal for military support, since he was basically unable to protect Babylonia from an Elamite invasion, because he had not been supplied with any sizable military force. And so the army of Ashurbanipal moved south Tukder, Teoman marched to confront the Assyrians, but he quickly had second thoughts and returned to Susa. That was the capital of the Elamite kingdom. And then the Battle of Ulai, the last engagement in the Teoman War, was fought close to Susa, ending in a resounding Assyrian victory, which Ashurbanipal gives an account of in his inscriptions. And it goes like this. Like the onset of a terrible hurricane, I overwhelmed Elam in its entirety. I cut off the head of Teoman, their king, the haughty one who plotted evil. Countless of his warriors I slew. Alive, with my hands, I seized his fighters. With their corpses I filled the plain about Susa, as with Bautu and Ashagu. Their blood I let run down to the Ulai. Its water I dyed red like wool. Duranu and his family were captured and put to death after Duranu joined the Elamites in their war. Ashurbanipal's army attacked the Gambulians and ruthlessly punished them, flooding their capital city of Shapibel and killing many of its residents. After Dadanu consented to pay a sizable amount in tribute to the Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal named a noble named Urimitu as the new Gambulian chieftain in his place. Under Ashurbanipal's father's rule, Assyria had been invaded by the Cimmerians, a nomadic Indo-European people who lived in the southern Caucasus north of the country. The Cimmerians attacked Lydia in Gyges-ruled western Anatolia after being routed by Esarhaddon. Gyges sent his diplomats to Ashurbanipal to seek help after he supposedly had a dream in which the Assyrian deity Ashur gave him advice to do so. The Cimmerian invasion of Lydia was beaten around 665, after two states were successfully able to establish communications with the aid of interpreters, and the Assyrians were unaware that Lydia had even existed. Large quantities of spoils were secured by the forces of Ashurbanipal, and two Cimmerian chiefs were thrown into prison at Nineveh. In fact, it's unclear how much of Assyrian army actually participated in the Lydian campaign. But Gyges seems to be dissatisfied with the assistance because he only reformed his alliance with Ashurbanipal 12 years later and sided with Egypt, which was becoming more and more independent. Ashurbanipal then cursed Gyges. There was a great deal of celebration in Assyria when Lydia was overrun by its enemies between 652 and 650. Well, it's fair enough to have troubles abroad and triumphs abroad, but back home, things were about to warm up. Remember I said that equal share of rule was not going to work out? Well, in 652, Shamash-shum-ukin revolted, hoping to free Babylonia under his own rule and break away from Ashurbanipal. Later Aramaic language legends state that Serua-Eterat, the sister of Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin, tried to step in and actually talk her two brothers out of fighting. Legend has it that she vanished into self-imposed exile after the war had started. I can imagine it. I'm keeping out of this. Well, the brothers fought each other for 3 long years. Brutal ones at that. Shamash-shum-ukin's rebellion was not only aided by the southern certainty of support, but also by the Babylonians' ongoing resentment to Assyrian rule. The rulers of Elam were certain allies who were always prepared to support anyone who fought Assyria. Very old hatreds. According to inscription evidence, Shamash-shum-ukin called on the Babylonians to support him in his uprising. The statement, Ashurbanipal will cover with shame the name of the Babylonians, is attributed to Shamash-shum-ukin in Ashurbanipal's inscriptions. He uses words like lies to describe their communications with them. Soon after Shamash-shum-ukin launched his uprising, Ashurbanipal was joined by the rest of southern Mesopotamia in rebelling against him. Ashurbanipal's description of the conflict is as follows. In these days, Shamash-shum-ukin, the faithless brother of mine, whom I had treated well and set up as a king of Babylon, every imaginable thing that kingship calls for, I made and gave him, soldiers, horses, chariots, I equipped and put into his hands. Cities, fields, plantations, together with the people who live therein. I gave him in larger numbers than my father had ordered. But he forgot this kindness I had shown him and planned every evil. Outwardly with his lips he was speaking fair words, while inwardly his heart was designing murder. The Babylonians, who had been loyal to Assyria and faithful vassals of mine, he deceived, speaking lies to them. Shamash-shum-ukin was unable to stop Ashurbanipal's advance, in spite of this apparent alliance of Assyrian adversaries. His lands were lost, allies dwindled, and his forces were gradually routed as the war went on and on, every day getting worse and worse for him. With Ashurbanipal's forces having besieged Cutha, Borsippa, Sippar, and Babylon itself by 650, the situation appeared more or less hopeless. Of course, add into that a little bit of famine, and it's well and truly hopeless. According to Ashurbanipal's description of the siege, some of the locals became so desperate and hungry that they began eating their own children. After a 2-year siege, Babylon fell in 648. Ashurbanipal plundered it extensively, and according to his own inscriptions, I fed their carved-up bodies to dogs, to pigs, to wolves, eagles, to birds of the heavens, to fishes of the deep. A massive fire spread throughout Babylon at the same time the city fell. According to conventional wisdom, Shamash-shum-ukin took his own life by burning himself and his family in his palace. Only that he met a cruel death, and that the gods consigned him to a fire and destroyed his life are mentioned in the text from those days. Perhaps he didn't do it himself. Perhaps he was simply locked in. Maybe we'll never know. I don't think he had time to scribble down a cuneiform tablet in those last moments. In addition to the reported taking his own life by self-immolation or another method, it seems that he could have been executed or just died in another matter. It would make sense for the Assyrian scribes to probably omit the execution of Shamash-shum-ukin from historical accounts, because you see, it's still, yes, the killing of an enemy, but fratricide, i.e. killing one's own brother, and that was forbidden and would still be considered murder regardless of the circumstance of an Assyrian royal family member, had it been committed by a soldier rather than Ashurbanipal. I mean, he could get away with it, but no one else really could. Well, little is known about Kundalanu, the new vassal king of Babylon that Ashurbanipal installed following the defeat of his brother, except for Nippur, which Ashurbanipal turned into a strong Assyrian stronghold. Kundalanu's kingdom was identical to Shamash-shum-ukin's. Few records of Kundalanu's reign in Babylon survive, and his authority was probably quite limited. He could have been a Babylonian nobleman, who sided with Ashurbanipal during the civil war and was subsequently rewarded with the title of king. Or he could have been just another one of Ashurbanipal's lesser-known brothers. Either way, since Ashurbanipal held all the real political and military power, Kundalanu most likely didn't really have much pull in reality. Just kind of put there to have someone in the seat. Well, of course, this whole situation of defeating Shamash-shum-ukin was seen as more of a problematic victory because it resulted in the death of a member of the royal family. And once again, regardless of circumstances, that is never good. Significant wider repercussions of the civil war also affected Assyrian dominion. The conflict depleted the economic resources and diminished the Assyrian Empire's power and authority. Despite Babylonia's gradual post-war recovery, but even that was a hard slog. Well, even though there had been indications of deterioration prior to civil war, historians do believe that the conflict's conclusion signified the end of Assyrian power. There was just too many resources wasted. In addition to inciting anti-Assyrian sentiment in southern Babylon, Ashurbanipal's sack of that city, the second large-scale sack of it in the space of 30 years, may have played a key role in the Babylonian uprising of Nabopolassar a few years after Ashurbanipal's passing, which resulted in the establishment of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the true fall of Assyria. While the early defeat of Umanigash's army near the city of Der had effectively ended the Elamite effort to aid Shamash-shum-ukin in the civil war. And following his defeat, Tamaritu II overthrew him in Elam and seized the throne for himself. Ashurbanipal gave Umanigash asylum after he fled to the Assyrian court. Tamaritu ruled for a short time before being overthrown in yet another uprising in 649, despite a few victories against the Assyrians. He was accompanied by the renegade governor, Nabu-bel-Shumati, who was already well known for his involvement in the conflict with Shamash-shum-ukin because of the kingdom's support for him and his other enemies. Ashurbanipal threatened to invade Elam once more, which led to the assassination of the new king, Indabibi, who ruled for a bit of a short time. Humban-Haltash III succeeded Indabibi as the king of Elam. Humban-Haltash was in favor of surrendering the Chaldean rebel, but Nabu-bel-Shumatu had too many supporters in Elam for this to work. Nabu-bel-Shumati continued to fight Ashurbanipal from outposts within Elam. Thus, in 647, the Assyrians invaded Elam once more because Humban-Haltash was unable to react to Ashurbanipal's threats. Humban-Haltash left his seat at Madaktu and fled into the mountains, while the Elamite defense behind him crumbled. Tamaritu II briefly succeeded him as king and reclaimed his position. Following their return home after the Assyrians had ravaged Khuzestan, Humban-Haltash rose again from the mountains and reclaimed the throne. In 646, the Assyrians made their way back to Elam, and Humban-Haltash once more fled Madaktu, first to Dur-Undash, and then to the mountains in eastern Elam. While pursuing him, Ashurbanipals pillaged and destroyed any cities they could find, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake, like a melted Kit Kat. Just seeing if you're paying attention. Nearby chiefdoms and petty kingdoms that had previously paid homage to the Elamite king started doing so to Ashurbanipal after all of Elam's major political centers were destroyed. One of these kingdoms was Parsua, which may have been an antecedent of the Achaemenid Empire that would be established a century later. The king of Parsua, Cyrus, who might have been the same person as Cyrus I, that being the grandfather of Cyrus the Great, had been forced to provide his son Aruku as a hostage, because he had initially sided with the Elamites at the start of the campaign. Nations that had never interacted with the Assyrians before, like a kingdom that extended beyond Elam, and was also ruled by a king named Umidri, also started honoring the Assyrians. And then Susa was ruthlessly pillaged by the Assyrian forces as they returned from their campaign. Ashurbanipal's triumphant inscriptions about the sack go into great detail about how they destroyed temples, and it reads as following. Susa, the great holy city, abode of their gods, seat of their mysteries, I conquered, according to the word of Ashur and Ishtar. I entered its palaces. I dwelt in their rejoicing. I opened the treasures where silver, gold, and goods and wealth were amassed, the treasures of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, that the ancient kings of Elam had looted and carried away. I destroyed the ziggurat at Susa. I smashed its shining copper horns. In Shushanak, god of the oracles, who resides at these secret places, where no man sees his divine nature, with their jewelry, their wealth, their furniture, the priests, I brought as booty to the land of Ashur. I reduced their temples of Elam to naught, their gods scattered to the wind. The secret groves, where no outsider had ever penetrated, where no layman had ever trod, my soldiers entered. They saw their mysteries and destroyed them by fire. The tombs of their ancient and recent kings who had not feared the goddess Ishtar, my lady, and who were the cause of torments to the kings, my fathers. Those tombs I devastated. I destroyed. I exposed to the sun, and I carried away their bones toward the land of Ashur. I devastated the provinces of Elam, and on their lands I spread salt. The Elamites persisted as a political group for a while, in spite of the exhaustive and violent campaign, and instead of annexing Elam, Ashurbanipal let it be. Although Nabu Bel-Shmati later took his own life on the road to Nineveh, Humban-Haltash returned to power at Madaktu, and later sent himself to Ashurbanipal. Elam is not mentioned in Assyrian records after Humban-Haltash was overthrown and sent to the Assyrians in rebellion shortly after. Either way, after 646, Elam was never fully able to recover and was always vulnerable to attacks by tribes and kings, eventually vanishing completely from history. Another empire grinded into the dust. Well, in the Assyrian Civil War, a few Arab tribal leaders actually sided with Shamash-shum-ukin. Among them was his brother, Aya-Amu, who dispatched soldiers to Babylonia, and Abiyate, who was the crowned king by Ashurbanipal's army. You see, at first, Ashurbanipal's attention to Elam allowed them to avoid punishment and reprisals. As the Elamite wars continued, a number of Arab kings stopped honoring Ashurbanipal and started attacking Assyrian communities in the area, which of course had pretty devastating effects on trade as well. The generals of Ashurbanipal organized a significant campaign to restore order after this development proved sufficient. The main focus of Ashurbanipal's account of this conflict is his army's travels across Syria in pursuit of Uyate, who is sometimes confused with Yauta, but may actually be someone else, and his Arabian soldiers. The story goes that the Assyrian army marched from Syria to Damascus and then to Huliti, where they defeated Usho and Akko and took Abiate. According to reports, the hostile and unfamiliar terrain presented significant challenges for the Assyrians during the conflict. It is stated that Nabayate, who had supported Ashurbanipal in the first campaign, lost the second war against the Arabs, but it is not explained why their relationship with Ashurbanipal changed between the two campaigns. The final known version of the Arabian story mentions the two campaigns as part of Ashurbanipal's 9th campaign and goes into further detail about them. According to this version, Shamash-shum-ukin was joined by Abiate and Amul-ad-Din. For the first time, Ashurbanipal is also given direct credit for the campaign's success in this version. According to this later version, Ayamanu was actually skinned alive. Uyate was tied up to Ashurbanipal's chariot like a horse, and Uyate was captured and paraded in Nineveh alongside prisoners taken during the Elamite Wars. Well, due to the lack of available sources, the end of Ashurbanipal's reign and the start of his son and successor Ashur-etil-ilani are more than a little mysterious. Since the secure eponym canon, known as the Assyrian year names, ends in 649, events during Ashurbanipal's reign up to that year are comparatively poorly documented. Compared to the numerous records from earlier years, Ashurbanipal only left 2 inscriptions after 639. This lack of documentation could be seen as an impending internal crisis. The king and the empire's traditional elite seem to have become increasingly estranged during the final days of his reign. It seems that Ashurbanipal severely elevated eunuchs to high positions at the expense of the aristocracy and nobility. And of course, they would not have been very happy about that. In an unprecedented and possibly self-indulgent move, Bulutu, the chief singer, was given his own name towards the end of his reign. While some Assyriologists have compared the scant evidence from Ashurbanipal's late reign to Sardanapalus, the decadent final king of Assyria in Greco-Roman literature. I suppose there's something to that. Well, even Ashurbanipal acknowledged his failure to keep the Assyrian Empire resilient. We have one of his last known inscriptions, where he bemoaned the state of his empire while feeling depressed and confronted with his own impending death from illness. And he wrote as following: "I cannot do away with the strife in my country, and the dissensions in my family. Disturbing scandals oppress me always. Illness of mind and flesh bow me down. With cries of woe I bring my days to an end. On the day of the city god, the day of the festival, I am wretched. Death is seizing hold upon me and bears me down." Apart from internal conflict, it's evident that by the end of the reign of Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian Empire's control over its surrounding areas had weakened significantly. Certain outlying regions had reclaimed their independence. For example, the Assyrians were no longer present in the southern Levant, prime real estate, that's for sure, where the Egyptians had taken over as the dominant force. It's possible that religious movements in Babylonia, which were the forerunner of Nabopolassar's, started during Ashurbanipal's final reign. Egypt had already reclaimed its independence during Ashurbanipal's rule. Psamtik I, the son and successor of Necho I, who had received his education at the Assyrian court, seems to have brought about Egypt's peaceful and gradual liberation. As a faithful Assyrian vassal, Psamtik ascended to the throne in 664 and gradually expanded his rule over all of Egypt. Eventually, in 656, he united the nation and brought about a period of prosperity and a kind of renaissance before achieving a complete independence from Ashurbanipal. Both Psamtik and his son Necho II hurried to Assyria's aid during the later Medo-Babylonian conquest of the Assyrian Empire under the rule of Sin-Sharishkun, or Ashur-etil-Ilani's successor, another son of Ashurbanipal, and the Egyptian armies fought alongside the Assyrians. Ashur-etil-Ilani's inscriptions imply that his father passed away naturally, but they don't specify how or when exactly this occurred. Although his last year is frequently incorrectly recorded as 627 or even 26, this is based upon estimates from an inscription that Adad-Gupi, the mother of the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus, wrote at Haran almost a century later. But a 631 contract from Nippur provides a last modern proof that Ashurbanipal was alive and ruling as a king. Given that the city was taken by Nabopolassar in 626 and never again fell into Assyrian hands, the inscriptions of Ashurbanipal's successors, Ashur-etil-Ilani and Sin-Sharishkun, in Babylon spanning several years, would not have been possible if his reign had ended in 627. It is also generally accepted that Ashurbanipal either died, abdicated, or was overthrown in 631 or 630, in order to match the attested durations of his successors' reigns. So usually, 631 is chosen as the year that he really passed away. Ashur-etil-Ilani succeeded Ashurbanipal as king, and he appears to have been motivated by his father's succession plans, despite the negative outcomes. Since Sin-Sharishkun was given the fortress city of Nippur and was chosen to succeed Kundalanu in Babylon after Kundalanu's death. Well, Assyrian royal ideology held that the king was Ashur's divinely appointed mortal representative. The king had a moral, humane, and a necessary duty to expand Assyria, because lands outside of Assyria were considered uncivilized and a threat to the cosmic and divine order. Instead of exploitative imperialism, expansionism was portrayed as a moral obligation to civilize the chaos. The Assyrian king represented Ashur, so opposing his rule was considered a rebellion against divine will and punishable by law. Therefore, rebels violated the divine world order according to Assyrian royal ideology. So when we look back on Ashurbanipal's reign, I suppose we could almost call him a religious extremist, some kind of fundamentalist, especially with all the massacres and the temple burnings. Those poor Elamites, all those Babylonians. Well, under Ashurbanipal, of course, the Assyrian army fought its largest campaign outside the heartland, and he was the most brutal Assyrian king, even though he rarely participated in military campaigns, but boy oh boy when he did. Given that Ashurbanipal rebuilt, restored, and expanded most of his empire's major shrines, and was interested in omen reports, his excessive brutality seems to have been motivated by this religious zeal. He was just doing it because Ashur told him to. He also appointed his younger brother, Ashur-etil-Shame-eresti-Mubalisu, and another brother, Ashur-mukin-Valea, as priests in Haran and Assur. Of course, his reign has the most Neo-Assyrian reliefs depicting violence. The reliefs contain 35% of Neo-Assyrian violent depictions. And that's, well, over the course of all of that time for one ruler to occupy that much. It seems that he is the cruelest monarch in a variety of scenes. Now only 4 Neo-Assyrian kings, Esarhaddon, Tiglath Pileser III, and Ashurbanipal II, claimed in their inscriptions to have killed civilians and committed heinous acts against them. We're talking dismemberment, skinning them alive, impalement, all the horrible things of the masochist's imagination. In fact, Ashurbanipal's reliefs are one of the few Assyrian works to actually depict women as victims. One of them depicts both direct assaults on women and their corpses. In fact, one relief depicts the most heinous act, the tearing open of a pregnant woman. Perhaps the most heinous act against a woman ever recorded in history up to that point. Not good. Not good at all. Well, after the Assyrian Empire fell, Ashurbanipal's stories lived on in the Near East for centuries. He is known as Nebuchadnezzar in the Book of Judith. Northern Mesopotamian literature and folklore featured Ashurnarpal and other Assyrian rulers too. The most famous Ashurbanipal legend was the long-lived Greco-Roman Sardanapalus legend. It's been described as more effeminate than a woman, a vivacious and idle man, a governor who loathed all expressions of militarism and war. But then again, that's the Greeks telling the story. And they saw ancient Mesopotamian kings as drab and feminine rulers who couldn't really protect their subjects. In fact, they all got very annoyed when Alexander the Great started exhibiting Eastern qualities after his conquests. And you see, this happens quite a lot when people end up going over to Persia and conquering them. They end up becoming them. The Greeks did not like that at all. Well, regardless of what the Greeks liked, that's just the way it is. Now, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Amber, Ben, Brett, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitmas, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, Charlene, and Christopher. And just like that, we are at the end of the life of Ashurbanipal. Pretty brutal. Well, I suppose that's just how it was back then. Well, not for everyone. It just seems that Ashurbanipal was especially brutal. But oh well. What are you going to do about it? It's not much use complaining about it now, isn't it? Well, I will see you in the next video. As always, thank you for watching, and lots of love to you all.